Reality Case Studies, Season 4. Why is she still seeking their approval? The approval blueprint and how one woman inherits it, marries it, and passes it down. A Bowen Family Systems, Attachment and Generational Patterns Case Study, featuring MJ Javid from the Valley Persian Style. Welcome back to Reality Case Studies. If you're new here, my name is Stephanie Buckley. I'm an AMFT, ADHD, and OCD specialist and a family systems coach. I'm the neurotypical parent and spouse in a neurodivergent family. Our son, Taft Buckley, is a thriving 23 and neurodivergent with ADHD and OCD. He's a self-taught musician who plays by ear. He taught himself piano around age 10 by listening on repeat and finding the keys, and he once worked on Slow Dancing in a Burning Room by John Mayer more than 100 times in a single day. Today, he plays piano, guitar, drums, ukulele, and bass. He's a singer-songwriter and performer with the Taft Buckley Band, and his song, Thanks for Stopping By, is on Spotify. Before music became his passion, he spent nearly a decade as an elite sailor. He made his first U.S. sailing team at age 11 and competed in many countries such as Palamos, Spain, Lake Garda, Italy, South Africa, Sri Lanka, and Belgium. He played Beach Life Festival in 2025 on a lineup with Lenny Kravitz, Sublime, Alanis Morissette, Train, The Pretenders, Jackson Browne, The Beach Boys, and Marcus King. And again in 2026 with Duran Duran, The Offspring, James Taylor, The Chainsmokers, and Sheryl Crow. Sharing a festival stage with artists like these at 23 shows how far a supported neurodivergent brain can go. My husband of more than 30 years is also neurodivergent, with ADHD and OCD, and he plays by ear too. Both ADHD and OCD have strong genetic components. And that runs right through our family the way it runs through so many of yours. Between the two of them, my husband and my son have given me a front row seat to the creative, beautiful, and deeply capable mind that neurodivergence can be. Watching them up close, the way they hear music, the way they problem solve, the way they experience the world, is exactly why I focus on this work. They are the reason I do what I do, the reason I want other families to see the gift in their own kids and partners. And the reason I started this podcast in the first place, it's also why I practice the way I practice. I'm a solution-focused therapist. It's the approach I was forced to build in real time, in my own home, because I needed to figure out how to work around the barriers our family system kept running into. When you love neurodivergent people and you're trying to keep a household running, you learn quickly that good intentions and insight alone don't change a Tuesday morning. You need tools. You need workarounds. You need to know what actually moves the needle. When individuals, couples, spouses, partners, and families come to see me, they are usually in crisis. They are not looking for a place to talk in circles. They need help, and they need it to work. Traditional talk therapy, on its own, often falls short with neurodivergent individuals because it treats the mind as if it floats free of the body and the environment around it. It doesn't. So instead, I look at the whole person and the whole system, the family dynamics, the patterns that repeat across generations, and all the quieter levers that either steady a nervous system or push it toward the edge. And I mean all of them: sleep hygiene, hydration, exercise and movement, screen time and how it's structured, nutrition, and yes, the specific things, hiding in the food, nitrates, food dyes, the additives that can light up an already sensitive system. Love languages so people can actually feel loved in a language they can receive. Parenting styles, routines, boundaries, responsibilities, and chores, because predictability and clear structure are regulating, not restrictive. Every one of these plays a significant role in whether a family moves through and past a difficult time or stays stuck inside it. And then there's the developmental work that sits underneath so much of what I do, especially with young people and the parents raising them. Executive function, the brain's management system for planning, starting, and following through. Scaffolding, the practice of giving just enough support and then slowly removing it as capacity grows. Building genuine confidence and independence while watching carefully for learned helplessness, the pattern where a person stops trying because they've been rescued or corrected one too many times. And self-advocacy, teaching people to understand and speak up for what their own brain and body need. This is the whole person, whole system, solution-focused lens I'll be using as we study today's case, and it's the same lens I'd want you holding up to your own family. We use reality television as a teaching mirror, not gossip. What you'll always hear from me is this: what we're doing is a case study, not a diagnosis. As always, this is a case study, not a diagnosis. I have never met, treated, or assessed MJ Javid, her parents, her former husband Tommy, or their son. Everything I'm working from is publicly available. She's shared it herself across multiple seasons of Shahs of Sunset, in interviews, and on Jeff Lewis Live. We're not here to decide what's true about her life. We're here to study the observable patterns, and then, in the part that matters most, to turn every one of them back toward our own lives. That turn is what separates a case study from gossip. So let me tell you why I wanted to sit with this particular story. Because on the surface, MJ's life looks like a story about a hard divorce, a lost dog, and a 7-year-old who has started talking to his mother with a sharp edge. And all of that is real. But underneath it, there is one thread running through everything, one pattern that shows up when she talks about her mother, when she talks about her marriage, and now when she talks about her son. It is the pattern of a woman who learned, very early, that love is something you earn by working hard enough to deserve it. And once you can see that thread, the whole story reorganizes itself in front of you. Today, we're going to look at that thread through 3 lenses: Bowen Family Systems Theory, which is the framework I use in my practice every single week to understand how families pass patterns down across generations. Attachment theory, which explains how the earliest bonds we form teach us what to expect from the people we love. And the specific mechanics of generational transmission, which is the fancy way of saying how a pattern travels from a grandmother through a mother into a child without anyone in the family ever deciding that it should. Let me start by explaining the lens, because I'm going to use it all the way through. And I want it to make sense to you, even if this is the very first thing you've ever read about family therapy. Bowen Family Systems Theory comes from a psychiatrist named Murray Bowen, and its central idea is beautifully simple and a little bit uncomfortable. It says that no person can be understood in isolation. You are not a self-contained unit. You are one part of an emotional system, usually your family, and that system has patterns that are older than you are. When we only look at one person and ask what is wrong with them, we miss the truth, which is that the person is often carrying something the whole system handed them. When I look at MJ, Bowen tells me not to ask, what is wrong with MJ? It tells me to ask, what is the pattern in this family? Where did it start? And how is it moving? That is a very different question, and it's a much kinder one, because it stops locating the problem inside one person's character and starts locating it inside a system that shaped everyone in it, including the people who did the hurting. The first Bowen concept I want to give you is called differentiation of self. Stay with me, because this one is the key to the whole episode. Differentiation of self is your ability to stay connected to the people you love while still holding on to your own thoughts, your own feelings, and your own sense of who you are. A well-differentiated person can be close to their family and still disagree with them. They can love their mother and not need their mother's approval to feel okay about themselves. A person with lower differentiation, and I want to be gentle here because most of us live somewhere in the middle, tends to fuse their sense of self to how the important people in their life feel about them. When those people approve, they feel whole. When those people are cold or critical, they feel like they are falling apart. Their emotional thermostat is set by someone else's hand. Here is why this matters for MJ. In episode after episode of Shahs of Sunset, across years, we watched a woman with a genuinely formidable work ethic, a woman who built things and provided and carried people, orient herself again and again toward one question: does my mother approve of me? When the approval didn't come, and often it didn't just disappoint her. It seemed to shake something foundational. That is what lower differentiation looks like from the outside. It is not weakness. It is a nervous system that was trained, very young, to read one particular person's face as the source of its safety. The second Bowen concept is the one this whole episode is built on, and it's called the multi-generational transmission process. That's a mouthful, so let me translate it. It means that patterns of relating, especially patterns around anxiety, closeness, and approval, get passed down from one generation to the next, usually without anyone intending it. A parent who was raised to earn love tends to raise children who also feel they must earn it, not because the parent is cruel, but because it's the only blueprint they were ever given. You cannot hand your child a map you were never given yourself. Watch how this moves through the family we're studying. There is MJ's mother, who, across many seasons, was publicly harsh and critical with her daughter in ways that were painful to witness. Whatever shaped that mother, and there is almost always a generation above her that we never see on camera, she passed to MJ a particular lesson. Love is conditional and criticism is how it's expressed. MJ absorbed that lesson so deeply that she spent decades trying to finally earn the approval that was always just out of reach. And now, if we watch carefully, we can see the third link forming. A 7-year-old boy who has begun to speak to his mother with disrespect in a tone that echoes the way the adults around him speak to her. The pattern is trying to make its third jump. That is the multi-generational transmission process happening in real time, and it is the most important thing in this entire story, because it is the link that is not yet set. It's still soft. It can still be interrupted. We'll come back to that, because that's where the hope lives. Now let me bring in the second lens, attachment theory, because it explains the emotional machinery underneath everything Bowen describes. Attachment theory, which began with a researcher named John Bowlby, says that in the earliest years of life, we form a working model of relationships based on how our caregivers respond to us. This working model is essentially a blueprint. It answers a question every baby is silently asking: when I need you, will you come, and will it be safe? The answer we get over and over hardens into an expectation we carry into every relationship for the rest of our lives, until we do the work to revise it. When a child receives warm, consistent, attuned care, they tend to develop what we call secure attachment. They grow up expecting that closeness is safe and that their needs are reasonable. But when a child receives love that is inconsistent, love that comes with warmth one moment and sharp criticism the next, they often develop an anxious attachment style. And I want to define that clearly, because MJ's story is, in many ways, a portrait of it. Anxious attachment is what forms when a caregiver is sometimes loving and sometimes rejecting, and the child can never quite predict which they'll get. The child's nervous system responds in the most logical way available to it. It becomes hypervigilant. It learns to monitor the caregiver constantly, to work harder, to perform better, to be more useful, all in the hope of coaxing out the warm version of the parent and avoiding the cold one. The anxiously attached child becomes exquisitely tuned to other people's approval, because as a child, their emotional survival genuinely depended on reading it correctly. Now hold that definition up against what we know. A daughter, an only child, raised by a mother whose approval was inconsistent and whose criticism was frequent. That is close to the textbook recipe for anxious attachment. And look at the coping strategy it produced: a ferocious work ethic, a drive to provide, to carry, to be indispensable. From the outside, we call that success, and it is. But underneath, for a person shaped this way, work and providing can become the strategy learned in childhood. If I am useful enough, if I do enough, maybe the love will finally feel secure. That is the anxious child's bargain, grown up and wearing a business suit. Here is where attachment theory becomes almost eerie in its precision. The blueprint we form in childhood doesn't just describe our past, it quietly selects our future. We are drawn, unconsciously, to relationships that feel familiar, and for a person with anxious attachment, familiar often means someone whose love is a little uncertain, a little withholding, a little out of reach, because chasing that love is the emotional home they know. On Jeff Lewis Live, MJ expressed genuine confusion about the end of her marriage. She said she believed she'd chosen a partner she would be with for the rest of her life. I want to treat that confusion with real tenderness because it's the confusion of almost everyone who has ever loved from an anxious blueprint. She wasn't choosing chaos on purpose. She was choosing what felt like love, and what feels like love to an anxiously attached person is frequently the very dynamic that hurt them first. Someone they have to work to reach, someone whose approval they have to earn. Others have noted, and she has said herself, that she worked hard and provided within that marriage too, for her partner as well as her son. That is the childhood strategy, running again in adulthood, in a new setting, with a new person, aimed at the same unreachable prize. It's because the nervous system reaches for home, and if home was a place where you earned love by working for it, that is the relationship that will feel deep in your body like belonging. Understanding this is the beginning of being able to choose differently. Before we get into the specific moments, let me give you a quick, respectful bio for anyone who doesn't follow this world, so you know exactly who we're studying and where these public moments come from. Mercedes Javid, who goes by MJ, is an Iranian-American real estate broker and reality television personality. Most people first came to know her on Bravo's Shahs of Sunset, which followed a group of Iranian-American friends navigating their careers, families, and Persian traditions in Los Angeles. She was part of that show for its full run of 9 seasons, from 2012 to 2021, and it's across those years that so much of what we're discussing today played out in public, her genuinely formidable work ethic, and the long, painful, on-camera relationship with her mother that sits at the center of this episode. Right now, she stars on a newer Bravo series called The Valley, Persian Style, which premiered in January of 2026. It's a spin-off that reunites several of the Shah's cast, now trading Beverly Hills for suburban family life in the San Fernando Valley. This is the show where we're watching the next chapter unfold, her separation and divorce from her husband Tommy, their co-parenting of their young son, and the ripple effects of all of it. So when I reference something she said on camera or in an interview, that's the world it's coming from. 2 chapters of one very public life and one pattern running quietly underneath both of them. And let me name one more thing that matters for our lens, because it's not incidental. MJ is an only child from a Persian family, and in many Persian and broader Middle Eastern cultural traditions, a child, regardless of gender, carries a deep and honored responsibility to care for and provide for their parents as they age. But when you take a cultural expectation of devoted provision and lay it on top of an anxious attachment blueprint and a mother whose approval was hard to earn, you get a person for whom working, providing, and caring others isn't just love. It becomes the whole definition of being a good daughter. Hold that in mind because it deepens everything we're about to look at. Now let's bring this down out of theory and into the specific, painful moments that listeners keep asking about, because this is where the frameworks earn their keep. Here is the situation as MJ described it publicly. She was thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., for a funeral and had asked her soon-to-be former husband to watch her dog, an animal she's had for about 10 years and has described as being like a daughter to her. And I want you to notice this as a series of choices, because that framing matters. He chose to let the dog out early in the morning in an area known for coyotes. When the dog went missing, he chose to call her, thousands of miles away and utterly unable to do anything about it, to deliver the news rather than quietly solving the problem himself the way a person can when they're the one actually there. And then he chose to stop looking because he was late for a meeting. Sit with the sequence because it's the whole point. This was a problem he was physically positioned to solve, and she was not. He could have kept searching. He could have knocked on doors, walked the trails, checked the app himself, handled it, and told her afterward that it was resolved. Instead, the labor and the terror got handed straight to the person who was helpless to act on them. She had to call a friend more than half an hour away to go search the trails, and only after a few hours later, and she was exhausted that she had learned her dog hand turned up safe, she held by a neighbor found through the next door app. The one person on the scene made it everyone's emergency but his own. Listeners have asked 2 questions about this, and I want to answer both through our lens rather than through anger. First, why did she ask him to watch the dog at all? And the answer is the ordinary one. They live a minute apart. He already had their son. The dog had always been part of their shared life, and there was no reason a person acting in good faith would expect disaster. That's not naivety. That's a co-parent extending ordinary trust. The second question is the harder one. What does it mean that it went the way it did? Here I want to be careful and clinical rather than diagnostic, because I have not assessed anyone. I'm not going to tell you what's in this man's heart. What I can tell you is what the pattern communicates, and why it's the kind of pattern that people with strong narcissistic traits so often repeat. It's rarely about the dog or the dishes or whatever the object happens to be. It's about who ends up carrying the distress. When a person hands you the crisis, at the exact moment you're most powerless to fix it, the effect, whether it's conscious or not, is that your peace becomes collateral and their inconvenience stays minimized. For someone organized around their own comfort and their own narrative, offloading the emotional weight onto the other person isn't a lapse. It's the whole familiar shape of how things go. And this is where I gently point to a wider pattern, because MJ has hinted at it herself, and others close to the situation have said it out loud, that there is a long history here she has largely chosen to keep private, a pattern of protecting him publicly while absorbing privately. Her own friends have noted that for years she said very little about the harder moments, that she carried and provided and smoothed things over, and that the version the audience sees is a fraction of the version she has lived. Consider the cruelty of the timing. She was standing at a funeral, mourning one member of her family, when she learned she might be losing another. She had asked him for one thing, to show up, and instead she was handed proof of the belief that has shadowed her entire life, that she can lean on no one, that safety is something only her own presence can guarantee, that to step away, even to grieve, is to risk losing what she loves. The dog survived. The lesson, sadly, was the one she already knew by heart. Here's what that does to her. And this is the part that connects to everything we've built. When someone treats the thing you love most as an afterthought, at the exact moment you are most helpless to protect it, the message the anxious nervous system receives is devastating, disappointing, and heartbreaking. What matters to me does not matter to you, and I cannot make you care. For a woman raised to believe she had to earn every ounce of care she ever got, it is the oldest wound there is, reopened. And understanding that is not about deciding he's a villain. It's about her finally seeing the pattern clearly enough to stop handing her most precious things to a system that has shown her again and again how it handles them. Still waiting for an apology and why it isn't coming. There's a companion detail MJ has shared on air that I can't let pass because it's one of the most quietly telling things in this whole story. She said she's still waiting for an apology and that it had been 3 weeks. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a small thing, a person wanting to hear, "I'm sorry." But underneath, it's a window into an entire relational pattern, and it deserves a name and an explanation. First, notice what the waiting itself is. To keep waiting for an apology is to keep the door open, to stay oriented toward the other person, to hand them one more time the power to make you whole. It's the pursuer position we talked about earlier. 3 weeks of waiting is 3 weeks of her nervous system still turned toward him, still hoping that this time he'll offer the repair that would finally say, "What matters to you matters to me." That hope is the very thread of the Earn Your Love blueprint, pulled tight. She is still, in a sense, waiting to be chosen. So why won't it come? Let me explain the psychology of the missing apology, because understanding it is what finally lets a person stop waiting. For most of us, apologizing costs a little pride, but buys back the relationship. And that's a trade we're glad to make. But for a person with strong narcissistic traits, an apology is not a small transaction. It threatens the fragile self at the center we described earlier. To say I was wrong and I hurt you is to admit imperfection, to lower the defended image, to grant that the other person's pain is real and was caused by them. For a self that is propped up by being right, being admired, and being the wronged party, a sincere apology can feel less like a courtesy and more like a small death. So it doesn't come because acknowledging it would cost them the very thing they're organized around protecting. Often what comes instead is silence, a non-apology, "I'm sorry you feel that way," or a flip of the script so that somehow they become the injured one. If you've ever waited and finally gotten an apology that left you feeling worse, that's the mechanism you were bumping into. Now here's the family systems question you're really asking. Is this pattern coming from her mother, from Tommy, or is she the one carrying it? And the answer, in Bowen terms, is that it's the system, and she sits right in the middle of it. Think about what she was trained in. A mother whose approval and warmth were inconsistent, who was, across many public years, more fluent in criticism than in repair. A child raised in that home does not typically receive a lot of genuine, humble, "I'm sorry, I was wrong." She learns instead that love means waiting, appeasing, and hoping the powerful person will soften. She grew up highly skilled at the one role that system needed, the one who waits for the apology and keeps the peace while she waits. Then, as the blueprint does, she chose a partnership that let her keep practicing that exact role. Whether or not Tommy withholds apologies the way the pattern suggests, the point is that MJ's nervous system knows this position intimately. She is not the origin of the pattern, and she is not to blame for it. But she is, right now, the one keeping it alive by continuing to wait. And that is actually the most hopeful sentence I can offer her, because the one person in this entire system she can change is herself. She cannot make her mother apologize for the past. She cannot make Tommy apologize now. But she can stop organizing her peace around an apology that the pattern predicts will never come. And that single act, letting go of the weight, is differentiation in its purest form. To MJ, and to every one of you sitting by a phone, waiting for words that aren't arriving, here is the reframe. You may never get the apology. Waiting for it keeps you tethered to the person who hurt you and hands them ongoing power over your healing. The work is to give yourself the acknowledgement you are waiting for them to provide. Yes, that was wrong. Yes, it hurt. And I no longer need them to agree, in order for me to move forward. When you stop waiting to be chosen, you finally get to choose yourself. And your children, watching, learn that their worth was never up for someone else's vote either. Listeners have reached for the word narcissism, and MJ herself has reached for that word as she has tried to understand first the relationship she shared with her mother throughout years of Shahs of Sunset, and now the painful unraveling of her marriage. Before we apply that label to anyone, I want us to slow down. Psychology asks us to do something that culture rarely does: become more precise before becoming more certain. That distinction matters because the word narcissist has become one of the most overused and misunderstood terms in modern conversation. It is often used as a synonym for selfish, difficult, insensitive, controlling, or emotionally unavailable. Those qualities certainly may exist alongside narcissism, yet they do not automatically constitute narcissism. Precision protects us from oversimplifying extraordinarily complex human beings. The first concept to understand is that narcissism exists along a continuum rather than within a simple either-or category. Imagine a spectrum extending from ordinary human development to severe personality pathology. At one end lies healthy narcissism, an essential aspect of normal psychological functioning. Every emotionally healthy person possesses a degree of narcissism. We all hope to feel valued by those we love. We all experience disappointment when overlooked, pride when our work is recognized, and moments of defensiveness when criticism touches something vulnerable within us. These experiences are not evidence of pathology. They reflect a nervous system that was designed for attachment, belonging, competence, and social acceptance. At the opposite end of that continuum resides what clinicians recognize as narcissistic personality disorder, a diagnosable personality disorder characterized by enduring and pervasive patterns that significantly impair relationships, empathy, identity, and interpersonal functioning. It is far less common than popular culture would suggest. A diagnosis requires far more than observing someone behaving selfishly, arrogantly, or inconsiderately. It requires careful clinical assessment conducted over time by a qualified mental health professional who can evaluate the person's developmental history, interpersonal functioning, psychological defenses, and the stability of these patterns across multiple contexts. Between those two endpoints lies the broad territory where most people reside. This middle ground contains narcissistic traits, narcissistic defenses, and narcissistic adaptations. These patterns can profoundly affect marriages, friendships, workplaces, and families. They can leave partners feeling chronically unseen, emotionally exhausted, confused, or perpetually responsible for regulating another person's emotional state. Yet the presence of these traits alone does not establish the presence of narcissistic personality disorder. Holding that distinction is intellectually honest, clinically responsible, and ultimately more compassionate toward everyone involved. With those guardrails firmly in place, we can begin exploring what contemporary psychology has discovered about narcissism itself. One of the greatest misconceptions is the belief that narcissism develops from excessive self-love. In reality, decades of developmental research, attachment theory, object relations theory, and psychodynamic psychology describe something remarkably different. At its psychological core, narcissism is frequently organized around an unstable sense of self rather than an inflated one. The external presentation may communicate confidence, certainty, superiority, entitlement, or exceptionalism. Beneath that presentation, however, many individuals experience an identity that feels surprisingly fragile, inconsistently integrated, and heavily dependent upon external validation for emotional stability. The confidence observers witness is often less a reflection of genuine self-esteem than it is a psychological structure designed to prevent deeply painful feelings of inadequacy, shame, rejection, or worthlessness from reaching conscious awareness. Psychologists sometimes describe these protective processes as defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms operate largely outside conscious awareness. Their purpose is not deception in the ordinary sense. Their purpose is psychological survival. The mind constructs elaborate strategies to protect itself from emotional experiences it perceives as intolerable. Grandiosity, excessive self-importance, chronic comparison, perfectionism, idealizing oneself while devaluing others, or requiring continual admiration may all function as defenses against an underlying fear that the authentic self is fundamentally defective or unworthy of love. This understanding fundamentally changes how we interpret the behavior. The relentless pursuit of admiration ceases to resemble simple vanity. It begins to resemble emotional regulation. Validation becomes psychologically load-bearing. Compliments temporarily stabilize an identity that struggles to maintain cohesion from within. Praise functions almost like oxygen to an internal self-structure that has never fully learned how to generate a stable sense of worth independently. Criticism, even when relatively mild, therefore carries a disproportionate emotional impact because it threatens the very psychological architecture that has been constructed to keep painful shame outside conscious awareness. Developmental psychologists often describe this as a disturbance in identity formation. Rather than developing an integrated and enduring sense of self that remains relatively stable across success and failure, admiration and disappointment, acceptance and rejection, the individual becomes increasingly dependent upon external feedback to determine who they are. Their internal world becomes organized around protecting that vulnerable self at nearly any cost. Understanding these developmental processes does not excuse harmful behavior. Compassion and accountability are never mutually exclusive. Someone may possess a profound history of emotional injury while simultaneously causing significant emotional injury to the people around them. Both realities can exist together. Psychology is not interested in assigning heroes and villains. Its purpose is to understand the developmental processes that give rise to behavior so that patterns can be recognized, interrupted, and, when possible, transformed. As we continue exploring MJ's story, I would invite you to hold on to one final thought. Our goal is not to determine whether someone deserves the label of narcissist. That question is ultimately far less useful than many people imagine. A far more meaningful question is this: what relational patterns are unfolding? What emotional injuries are being repeated? And what does this teach us about the ways family systems quietly shape the relationships we create decades later? That question moves us beyond labels and into understanding. And understanding is where meaningful change has always begun. The two presentations, grandiose and vulnerable narcissism. One reason narcissism has become so misunderstood is that most people recognize only one presentation. Popular culture has trained us to look for the loudest individual in the room, the charismatic executive, the attention-seeking celebrity, the person who appears convinced of their own superiority. While that presentation certainly exists, contemporary personality research suggests that narcissistic functioning can manifest in markedly different ways. Broadly speaking, clinicians often describe two predominant presentations: grandiose narcissism and vulnerable narcissism, sometimes referred to as covert narcissism. Although they may appear remarkably different on the surface, both are understood to serve the same underlying psychological purpose: protecting a profoundly unstable sense of self from feelings of shame, inadequacy, rejection, or psychological collapse. Grandiose narcissism is the presentation most people immediately recognize. These individuals often appear confident, charming, persuasive, ambitious, socially dominant, and highly invested in status, admiration, influence, or achievement. Their emotional defenses operate through expansion. They elevate themselves, minimize others, seek recognition, and often experience criticism as an assault on their identity rather than simply feedback about their behavior. When admiration is plentiful, they may appear engaging, generous, even magnetic. When admiration is withdrawn or criticism emerges, their interpersonal style can shift dramatically as psychological defenses become activated. Vulnerable or covert, narcissism is considerably more difficult to recognize precisely because its defenses operate in the opposite direction. Rather than projecting superiority, the individual often presents as chronically misunderstood, perpetually disappointed, emotionally injured, or uniquely burdened by the failures of others. They may appear hypersensitive, quietly resentful, emotionally fragile, or deeply self-sacrificing. Their suffering frequently occupies the emotional center of every relationship. The common misconception is that vulnerable narcissism represents humility. Clinically, it often represents another strategy for protecting the self. Where grandiose narcissism says, "I am exceptional," vulnerable narcissism quietly communicates, "No one suffers as deeply as I do." Both organize the emotional world around the self. Both struggle to genuinely tolerate another person's emotional experience when it competes with their own. Both can leave partners feeling increasingly invisible despite looking entirely different from one another. This distinction becomes especially important within family systems because grandiose and vulnerable presentations frequently become organized around one another. In some families, one individual openly dominates while another secures emotional control through chronic victimhood, guilt, helplessness, or moral superiority. The behavioral expressions differ dramatically. The organizing principle remains strikingly similar. The psychological processes people are actually describing. Much of today's public conversation focuses on identifying narcissists. Psychology is considerably more interested in identifying patterns of functioning. Patterns are observable. Diagnoses require clinical evaluation. When people describe someone as narcissistic, they are usually responding to a constellation of recurring interpersonal behaviors rather than making a diagnostic determination. Understanding those patterns with greater precision allows us to move beyond labels and toward genuine psychological insight. One of the most significant characteristics involves conditional empathy. Empathy refers to the capacity to recognize, understand, and respond appropriately to another person's emotional experience. Individuals with pronounced narcissistic traits are not necessarily incapable of empathy. Many demonstrate warmth, generosity, humor, and emotional attunement under circumstances that feel psychologically safe or personally rewarding. The difficulty often emerges when another person's needs begin requiring sacrifice, accountability, inconvenience, or sustained emotional presence. As psychological stress increases, empathy frequently diminishes. The emotional needs of others become progressively more difficult to tolerate because attention must be redirected toward protecting the individual's increasingly dysregulated internal world. Another frequently observed process involves psychological entitlement. Entitlement extends beyond believing one deserves success or respect. It reflects an implicit expectation that one's own needs, preferences, emotional priorities, or interpretations should carry disproportionate weight within relationships. Compromise gradually becomes experienced as loss. Accountability begins feeling like persecution. Mutuality becomes increasingly difficult because equality itself threatens the psychological hierarchy upon which the relationship has quietly become organized. Another common pattern is interpersonal exploitation. The word exploitation often evokes images of deliberate manipulation, yet clinically the process is frequently more subtle. Relationships become increasingly evaluated according to what they provide emotionally, financially, socially, professionally, or psychologically. The other person gradually becomes experienced less as an autonomous individual with independent needs and more as a source of emotional regulation, practical support, admiration, status, stability, or resources. Over time, reciprocity quietly erodes. One individual consistently gives more emotional labor. The other increasingly consumes it. Perhaps the most psychologically significant feature, however, involves what clinicians sometimes describe as a narcissistic injury, followed by a narcissistic response. A narcissistic injury occurs whenever an experience threatens the individual's carefully constructed self-image. Criticism, rejection, public embarrassment, diminished status, perceived disrespect, loss of control, or exposure of personal shortcomings can all function as narcissistic injuries because they activate profound underlying shame. Most psychologically secure individuals respond to criticism with some combination of reflection, discomfort, repair, or growth. Individuals operating from strong narcissistic defenses often experience criticism very differently. The criticism is not processed as information. It is experienced as psychological annihilation. When shame becomes intolerable, defensive processes rapidly mobilize. Responsibility may be externalized. Reality may be reinterpreted. Others may suddenly become the problem. Relationships may become organized around retaliation, withdrawal, intimidation, humiliation, or efforts to restore psychological equilibrium by diminishing someone else. This does not mean retaliation is inevitable. It does explain why observers often notice a striking pattern. The greatest emotional injuries frequently occur immediately following moments when the individual has experienced public criticism, perceived humiliation, or loss of status. Within the story MJ has publicly shared, many listeners have understandably noticed that timing. The incident involving her beloved dog reportedly unfolded while she was thousands of miles away, attending a funeral, and unable to intervene herself. Other discussions on Jeff Lewis Live have similarly referenced the private emotional consequences that seem to intensify following public conversations about the relationship. As clinicians, our task is not to assign motive. Our responsibility is to observe interactional patterns with humility and precision. Patterns invite curiosity. Certainty often closes it. Narcissistic supply, triangulation, and the recruitment of children. One final concept brings us directly back to Bowen Family Systems Theory, and perhaps most importantly, to 7-year-old Shams. Psychologists use the term narcissistic supply to describe the external sources of validation that help stabilize an individual's fragile sense of self. Admiration, loyalty, attention, agreement, compliance, status, emotional reactions, dependency, and idealization may all temporarily regulate underlying psychological insecurity. Viewed through this developmental lens, relationships begin serving an emotional regulatory function. People cease being experienced solely as loved ones. They also become sources of psychological stabilization. This creates particular challenges during separation and divorce. When one primary source of validation becomes unavailable, the family system often reorganizes itself in an effort to restore emotional equilibrium. Bowen described this reorganization through the concept of triangulation, the tendency for anxiety between two people to recruit a third person into the emotional field. Children are especially vulnerable to this process. Recruitment is rarely explicit. No parent needs to say, "Choose me." The emotional messages are frequently communicated through tone, facial expressions, repeated complaints, subtle rewards, shared grievances, emotional overdisclosure, exaggerated closeness, or the quiet relief a child experiences after aligning with one parent's perspective. Over time, the child's developing nervous system begins associating alignment with emotional safety. The child is not consciously manipulating anyone. The child is adapting to the emotional climate of the family. If disrespect toward one parent consistently receives approval, laughter, attention, validation, or increased closeness from the other parent, the behavior becomes reinforced through the principles of operant conditioning, the simple rule that behaviors followed by rewarding outcomes become increasingly likely to occur again. Eventually, what appears to be independent disrespect may actually represent a sophisticated form of emotional adaptation. The child has learned which behaviors reduce anxiety inside the family system. This is precisely where individual personality psychology intersects with Bowen Family Systems Theory. The central issue is no longer whether one adult possesses narcissistic traits. The more consequential question becomes, how is anxiety moving through this family? Who is carrying it? Who is regulating it? And what is the child learning about love, power, respect, and attachment as a result? That question moves us beyond labels. It moves us toward understanding the emotional architecture of the entire family system. And from a clinical perspective, that is where the deepest and most enduring work begins. There's another pattern worth naming. Each time MJ appears on Jeff Lewis Live, the conversation is steered toward her marriage and divorce, and each time she tries to redirect. People sometimes read that redirection as evasiveness. Through our lens, it looks like something else entirely. She has said, more or less directly, that when she speaks about the relationship publicly, the repercussions afterward are far greater than the audience can see. She's also expressed wanting to preserve a sense of decorum out of respect for her son, whose father this is. Bowen would call what she's attempting a form of differentiation under enormous pressure. She's trying to hold a boundary, to stay in relationship with the public conversation without letting it detonate her private life, and to protect her child from a conflict that isn't his to carry. That is genuinely hard work, and she's doing it in real time, on camera, in a system that keeps poking the exact spot she's trying to protect. Whatever else is true, that particular effort deserves recognition rather than suspicion. Now we arrive at the part of this story that keeps me up, in the good way, the way that makes me want to reach through the screen. The 7-year-old. MJ has shared that her son has begun to speak to her disrespectfully, with a tone and phrasing that echo the way she's spoken to by the adults in her orbit. And I want to name plainly what's happening because it's the whole reason this episode matters. The pattern is attempting its third generational jump. Grandmother to mother, we can see it. Mother's marriage, we can see it. And now a small boy is learning, by watching, how his mother is allowed to be treated. Children don't learn how to treat their parents from lectures. They learn it from the modeling in the room. Here's the Bowen truth, and I'm going to say it as gently as I can because it's a heavy one. We teach people how to treat us, not by what we say, but by what we consistently permit. A child who watches one parent speak with contempt to the other and sees no durable consequence absorbs a rule. This is how you talk to her, and it's allowed. Saying, "Don't talk to me that way," in the moment is necessary, but it is not, by itself, the lesson. The lesson is in the follow-through, in the calm, consistent structure that comes after the words. Without that structure, the disrespect doesn't fade with age. It grows with it into the teenage years and beyond. I need to be very clear here because a parent listening to this might feel a wave of fear or guilt, and I won't leave you there. A 7-year-old testing tone and watching what happens is doing exactly what 7-year-olds are built to do. He's running the experiment every child runs. What happens in this system when I do this? The behavior isn't the problem. The behavior is information. It's telling us the system needs new structure, and structure is something a parent can build. And here's the piece that I find genuinely hopeful, grounded in how much better we now understand these patterns. MJ herself has spoken about how her own mother has, over the years, learned and tried to do differently. To know better is to do better. That change may have come later than anyone wanted, and it doesn't erase the earlier damage, but it proves the single most important thing this episode has to offer. The pattern is not fixed. A person can learn a new way of relating and begin, imperfectly, to hand a different blueprint down. If a grandmother could begin to shift, a mother can absolutely interrupt the pattern before it sets in her son. The third link is soft. It has not hardened yet. That is not too late. That is exactly on time. What interrupting the pattern actually looks like. Because I never want to leave you with insight and no tools. Interrupting a multi-generational pattern with a young child rests on a few durable principles, and none of them require perfection. The first is calm, consistent structure. When the disrespect happens, the response is not a bigger emotional reaction, which only teaches the child that these words are a powerful lever. The response is a steady, unruffled boundary followed by a predictable, proportionate consequence, delivered the same way every time. Children feel safest and learn fastest inside consistency. The calm is not weakness, the calm is the whole treatment. The second is modeling the differentiation you want him to inherit. A child learns how a person is treated by watching how the adults treat her, yes, but he also learns from watching how she treats herself. When a mother holds a boundary without collapsing and without exploding, she is teaching her son, wordlessly, that she is a person whose limits are real. That's a lesson that outlasts any single argument. And the third is the one that connects all the way back to the top of this episode. The most powerful thing MJ can do for her son is the work of raising her own differentiation, of loosening the old grip of earn your love, of learning in her body that she does not have to be useful to be worthy. Because children don't inherit our words. They inherit our nervous systems. The most protective gift she can give that little boy is a mother who no longer believes, all the way down, that love is something you have to work hard enough to deserve. So what would I actually tell MJ to do? I never want to leave a parent with beautiful theory and empty hands, so let's get concrete and practical. Because this part matters even more in the middle of a divorce, when everything feels like it's shifting under your feet. When a child's world is being reorganized, and when he's watching one parent speak to the other in a way that isn't okay, the single most stabilizing thing you can give him is not more comfort and not more stuff. It's structure. Predictability is how a child's nervous system learns that the world is still safe, even while the adults are figuring things out. Build a routine and predictable daily expectations for both of you. Start with yourself, because a child reads the parent's steadiness before he reads the rules. Decide what your days look like, the rhythms, the expectations you hold for yourself, and then decide clearly what you expect from Shams, and keep those expectations the same from one day to the next. Predictable daily expectations are not rigid or unkind. They are the guardrails that let a child relax, because he always knows what comes next and what's being asked of him. In a season where his family is changing shape, that consistency is medicine. Chores now, not later, because they build the young man he's becoming. Here's something I want every parent to take to heart, and it's backed by decades of research on child development. One of the best predictors of a confident, capable young adult is doing chores as a child, and the earlier they start, the better. So the answer is chores now, at 7, not someday when he's older. And I want you to hear why this is so much bigger than a clean kitchen. Every single chore he does builds 3 things at once. It builds his confidence, because he sees himself as someone who can do hard things. It builds his executive function, the brain's ability to plan a task, sequence the steps, and follow it through to the end. and it becomes the scaffolding he'll stand on for the rest of his life. Each small responsibility supporting the next, bigger one. Make his bed his job each morning, not yours. Instead of you making his breakfast or his lunch while he watches, he helps you make it. Have him load the dishwasher. Have him take out the trash. These are not too much to ask of a 7-year-old. They are exactly right for a 7-year-old. And every time you do them for him instead, you are, with all the love in the world, quietly telling him he isn't capable. He is. Let him prove it to himself. Therefore, make his bed his job each morning, not yours. Instead of you making his breakfast or his lunch while he watches, he helps you make it. Have him load the dishwasher. Have him take out the trash. These are not too much to ask of a 7-year-old. They are exactly right for a 7-year-old, and every time you do them for him instead, you are, with all the love in the world, quietly telling him he isn't capable. He is. Let him prove it to himself. Praise the responsibility specifically. And when he does it, this is where the magic happens. Praise the responsibility and be specific. Not a vague, good job, but I love how you took out the trash and remembered to put a new bag in the can. Specific praise tied to responsibility tells his brain exactly which behavior earned that warm feeling, and it teaches him that being capable and being helpful is who he is. That is how you grow a young man who takes initiative without being asked. Use the word no, and then hold it. I'm going to say something that might land hard, and I say it with love. Children today do not hear the word no nearly enough, and no is not a mean word. No is a boundary, and boundaries are how a child learns where the safe edges of the world are. But the word only works if you hold it. If you set a boundary, you stick with it. The moment a child learns that no really means maybe, if I push hard enough, the boundary stops meaning anything, and he'll push harder every single time because you've taught him that pushing works. Mean what you say and say what you mean. Which brings me to the heart of all of this. Mean what you say and say what you mean. Never name a consequence you aren't fully prepared to follow through on, because a 7-year-old will call your bluff. And once he learns your words are negotiable, you lose the very thing that keeps him feeling safe. Let me give you real examples, because this is where parents trip. Do not say, clean up your toys or you're going to time out, if he might actually prefer time out to cleaning up, because then he happily marches off to time out, and guess who's left cleaning up the toys? You. The consequence has to be connected to the behavior, and it has to be something you'll actually do. And if you say, we are leaving this restaurant, if you keep speaking to me that way, then you had better be prepared to stand up, leave your food on the table, and walk out, even if it's inconvenient, even if you're embarrassed, even if the meal is half-eaten. Because the one time you follow through, you teach him more than 100 warnings ever could. He learns that your word is solid, and a child who knows his parents' word is solid is a calmer, more secure child. Being disrespectful is not to be tolerated. Here's how to hold that. Now let's talk directly about the disrespect, because this is the pattern we're trying to interrupt. A 7-year-old may be learning this tone from his father and modeling how he hears his father speak to you. That's real, and I understand it, and it is still true that you do not have to tolerate it. Modeling explains where it came from. It does not make it acceptable, and accepting it only teaches him that this is how you're allowed to be spoken to. Here are 3 ways that might sound in the moment. 1. He snaps, "No, I don't want to. You can't make me." You stay calm, you don't match his volume, and you say, "I don't speak to you that way, and you don't speak to me that way. Try again with a respectful voice, and then we'll talk." Then you wait. You don't proceed until the tone changes. 2. He mutters something unkind or mocking, the way he may have heard it modeled. You say evenly, "That was disrespectful. In this house, we're kind to each other even when we're frustrated. You can be angry, and you still have to be respectful." You're separating the feeling, which is always allowed, from the delivery, which is not. 3. He escalates, testing whether you'll flinch. You hold the line without heat. I can see you're upset, and I still won't be spoken to like that. When you're ready to try again kindly, I'm right here. Then you disengage from the power struggle. You are not punishing the emotion. You are refusing to reward the disrespect with a reaction, which is exactly the fuel it's looking for. Do things with him. Don't buy things for him. And here is a shift that changes everything, especially when guilt is in the air during a divorce, when it's so tempting to soften every hard moment with a purchase. Stop buying your children stuff. Start doing things with them. Connection is built through shared experience, not through a pile of new toys that teach him love arrives in a shopping bag. Order a hands-on project subscription like KiwiCo and build it together at the kitchen table. Cook together. Do the chores side by side and turn them into time together. When you teach him through interaction, you're giving him two things at once: the skill and the felt sense that he matters to you because you spend your actual self on him, not your credit card. Last one, and it's a big one. If he's spending his time on screens, channel that energy somewhere that will grow him. Sign him up for a team sport, soccer, lacrosse, jiu-jitsu, whatever lights him up. And here's the family systems reason this matters so much, especially right now. On a team, he's surrounded by other people modeling behavior in action. A coach who sets expectations and holds them, teammates who show him how effort and cooperation and losing gracefully actually look. When one parent is modeling something you don't want him to absorb, a wider village of healthy models is one of the most protective things you can build around him. He gets to see, again and again, other ways that people treat each other, and children become the patterns they're surrounded by. Love languages, making sure he can actually feel your love. I want to slow down and teach one more idea because it sits underneath so much of what we've talked about, and it may be brand new to you. It's the concept of love languages, first described by a counselor named Gary Chapman, and the core idea is simple and life-changing. People give and receive love in different primary ways, and if you love someone in a language they don't naturally speak, your love can be pouring out of you and still not fully landing for them. Two people can love each other with their whole hearts and still both feel unloved, simply because they're speaking past each other. There are 5 of these languages, and let me define each one plainly. Words of affirmation, which is love felt through spoken and written words, encouragement, praise, being told you matter. Quality time, which is love felt through undivided, present attention, the phone down, the eyes up. Physical touch, which is love felt through hugs, a hand on the shoulder, closeness. Acts of service, which is love felt through someone doing helpful things for you. And receiving gifts, which is love felt through thoughtful tokens that say, I was thinking of you. Now here's why this matters for MJ, and it connects straight back to the beginning of this episode. Remember the approval blueprint, the belief that love is something you earn by working hard and providing. A person shaped that way often defaults to loving through acts of service and gifts, because that's the language that got modeled to them: do enough, provide enough, and maybe you'll be loved. But a 7-year-old boy in the middle of his parents' divorce may most need quality time, physical touch, and words of affirmation, love he can feel in his body without having to earn it. If MJ pours acts of service and gifts at him while he's quietly starving for presence and reassurance, they can both end up feeling unmet. So the invitation is to learn his language, watch how he gives love and what he asks for, and speak it on purpose. And notice, this is also why doing things with him beats buying things for him. For most children, quality time reaches deeper than another gift ever will. And there's a gift for MJ hidden in here too. Learning to receive love in languages other than usefulness, to let herself be loved for who she is, rather than for what she provides, is the very same differentiation work we've been circling all episode. When she can feel love without earning it, she can teach her son to do the same. but I never want to hand you a beautiful idea like receive love without showing you how, because for a person built to earn it, receiving is genuinely the hard part. It can feel unnatural, even unsafe, like you're getting away with something. So let me give you small, concrete ways to practice, because this is a muscle and it strengthens with reps. When someone gives you a compliment, practice not deflecting it. The earn your love reflex is to bat it away, oh, it was nothing, or to immediately hand it back, well, you're the one who really did the work. Instead, just say thank you and let it land. Feel the discomfort and don't fix it. That pause, that willingness to simply receive the kind word is the entire exercise. When someone offers to help you, practice saying yes instead of I've got it. For a provider, that reflexive I've got it is armor. Let a friend carry something. Let someone bring you the coffee. Let your people do for you the way you're always doing for them. You are allowed to be on the receiving end. Notice that the relationship doesn't collapse when you're not the one giving. That's the lesson your nervous system needs to learn. Let people show up for you and don't keep score. Remember the funeral when your friend drove out and walked the trails searching for your dog? That was love, given freely, and you did not have to earn it or repay it. Practice letting that be enough without immediately calculating how you'll make it up to them. Love that doesn't require repayment is exactly the kind you're learning to trust. Receive your son's affection without turning it into a task. When Shams climbs into your lap or wants your attention, resist the pull to make the moment productive, to use it to teach, to correct, to accomplish. Just be with him. Let his love for you be something you soak in rather than something you have to earn by doing. That is quality time flowing toward you, and letting it in is how you show him that love can simply be received. And practice one quiet sentence on your own until it feels true. I am worthy of love even when I am not being useful. Say it in the car. Say it when you catch yourself overfunctioning. Every time you let love in without earning it, you are rewriting the blueprint, not just for you, but for the little boy who is watching how his mother lets herself be loved. Parenting styles. Which one is running the home? The last framework I want to give you is parenting styles, because knowing which one you lean into, especially under the stress of a divorce, tells you a great deal about the patterns forming in your home. This comes from the research of a developmental psychologist named Diana Baumrind, and it describes 4 broad styles, sorted along 2 simple lines: how much warmth and responsiveness a parent offers, and how much structure and expectation they hold. The first is authoritarian parenting. This is high structure but low warmth. Lots of rules, lots of control, obedience demanded, but not much emotional attunement. The message is essentially because I said so. Children raised this way often comply out of fear rather than understanding, and it can quietly feed the very approval-seeking we've been studying because love feels conditional on getting it right. The second is permissive parenting. This is the mirror image: high warmth but low structure. Very loving, very responsive, but few firm boundaries and little follow-through. This is the style that tends to creep in during a divorce when guilt is high and a parent softens every hard moment. The child feels adored but unmoored, because without structure, a child doesn't feel free, he feels anxious. This is exactly the trap of buying stuff instead of holding limits. The third is uninvolved parenting, sometimes called neglectful, which is low on both warmth and structure. The parent is checked out, whether from overwhelm, their own pain, or distraction. This is worth naming gently in a co-parenting context, because when one parent drifts toward disengagement, the child often reads it as rejection and reaches even harder for the other parent's approval. And the fourth, the one the research consistently links to the most confident, capable, emotionally healthy children, is authoritative parenting. And please don't confuse it with authoritarian. They sound almost identical and mean nearly opposite things. Authoritative parenting is high warmth and high structure at the same time. It's the parent who holds firm, consistent boundaries and offers deep warmth and empathy in the very same breath. It sounds like, I love you completely, and the answer is still no. It's the both, and I've been describing this entire episode, the calm limit and the tender heart together. What authoritative parenting sounds like. I want to make authoritative parenting so concrete you could use it tonight, because a framework you can't hear in your own kitchen isn't much help. So let me walk you through the everyday flashpoints, disrespect, not listening, and the big transitions like school and bedtime, and give you actual words. In every single one, notice the formula underneath. I name the warmth and I hold the structure in the same breath. That both and is the whole style. You are never choosing between being kind and being firm. You are always doing both. When a child speaks to you disrespectfully, 1. The calm name and redo. You keep your voice low and even, because matching his heat just hands him your power. You say, that tone doesn't work with me. I know you're frustrated, and I want to hear you. Try that again in a respectful voice, and I'm all yours. Then you actually pause and give him the chance to redo it. When he does, you warm right back up, so he learns that respect reopens the connection instantly. 2. The feeling yes, delivery no. You separate what he feels, which is always allowed, from how he's delivering it, which is not. You say, you're allowed to be angry. You are not allowed to speak to me like that. Both of those things are true at the same time. This teaches emotional regulation and respect together, which is exactly the pairing his developing brain needs. 3. The quiet withdrawal of the audience. If he's escalating to get a reaction, you refuse to feed it without punishing the emotion underneath. You say once, evenly, I'm not going to talk about this while I'm being spoken to that way. I'll be right here when you're ready to try again kindly. Then you turn to something else and let the silence do the teaching. You're showing him that disrespect ends the conversation and respect restarts it. When a child isn't doing what you asked, 1. The connect then direct. Kids comply far better when they feel seen first, so you get down to his level, make eye contact, and put a hand on his shoulder before you give the instruction. Hey, I know those blocks are fun. It's time to put them in the bin now. I'll start with you. Connection first, direction second, and often you help with the very first piece to break the inertia. 2. The when then, not if then. You link what he wants to what you've asked in a calm, matter-of-fact way that isn't a threat, just the natural order of things. When your shoes are on, then we can head to the park. Notice it's when, not if. You're not bribing and you're not warning, you're simply stating the sequence, and the choice about how fast it goes is his. 3. The limited, empowering choice. When a child digs in, handing him a small, contained choice gives his brain a sense of control while the outcome stays non-negotiable. Do you want to put your pajamas on first or brush your teeth first? You pick. The bedtime itself isn't up for debate, but he gets to steer inside it, and that little bit of ownership dissolves a surprising number of standoffs. Transitions are where most family mornings and nights fall apart, and it's almost never defiance. It's that a child's brain struggles to stop one thing and start another. Therefore, we build ramps instead of cliffs. Give a heads up before every switch. 5 more minutes, then we clean up for bed. The warning lets his nervous system prepare, and a child who's prepared fights you far less. Make the steps visual and predictable, because at 7, a picture chart on the wall becomes his boss instead of you. A simple morning list, get dressed, make bed, eat breakfast, shoes and backpack, or a bedtime list. Pajamas, brush teeth, books, lights, lets him check off his own progress. Now you're not nagging, you're just asking, what's next on your chart? And handing the responsibility back to him, which is exactly how you build independence instead of learned helplessness. And protect the routine by protecting the clock. Most bedtime battles are really overtired battles, and most frantic mornings are really rushed mornings. Start the wind down earlier than feels necessary. Keep screens out of the last stretch before bed because they light the brain up right when you need it to power down. And lay out clothes and pack the backpack the night before so the morning has less to fight about. Calm is something you build in advance, not something you summon in the moment, empowering him to own his time and his chores. Here's the mindset shift that changes your parenting. Your goal is not to get him to obey you. It's to hand him ownership of himself, one small piece at a time. Therefore, let him feel the natural consequence when it's safe to. If the morning chart isn't done and you run a little late, let him feel that mild discomfort rather than rescuing him by doing it all yourself. Natural consequences teach what lectures never can, and they teach him without you having to be the bad guy. Give him a real, age-appropriate job that the family actually depends on. Feeding the dog, setting the table, taking out the trash, and let it be his, consistently. When a child owns a role the household genuinely needs, he stops feeling like a guest in his own life and starts feeling like a contributing member of the team. That belonging is one of the strongest protective factors a child can have. Then catch him doing it right and name it specifically, the way we talked about earlier. You got your shoes on before I even asked. That's what I call responsible. You are wiring his identity, telling him not just that he did a good thing, but that he is a capable, dependable person. And a child who believes that about himself becomes the young man who lives up to it. Next time on Reality Case Studies, Season 4, Episode 2, MJ and Tommy, Teach Him to Fish. The blueprint that chose the marriage and how to co-parent a capable kid through narcissistic traits. We go deeper. We started this episode with the thread that MJ learned love was something you earn. And next time we follow that thread all the way back to its source. How the patterns she absorbed from her own two parents, watching how they treated her and how they treated each other, quietly built the platform she was standing on when she chose the partner she did. Because we don't pick from a blank page, we pick from a blueprint. Then we get practical, and we stay practical. We'll go deeper on the idea that teaching her son to fish will matter far more than feeding him for a day, and why that shift may turn out to be her single greatest parenting victory. We'll take chores and routines and boundaries further than we could today, into the how, not just the why. We'll talk about why team sports and exercise aren't extras. They're essential regulation for a developing nervous system, and how movement steadies a child from the inside out. And we'll sit with one of the hardest realities so many of you are living: how to co-parent with someone who exhibits narcissistic traits, how to hold your boundaries, protect your child, and keep your own peace when the other side isn't playing by the same rules. The path to peace pause. And now, we come to one of my favorite parts of every episode, the path to peace pause. This is the moment where we stop studying the people on the screen and turn the lens back toward ourselves. I'm going to give you a handful of quiet questions, and they're meant not to be answered quickly, but to be carried with you into the drive, into the dishes, into the quiet part of the night. 1. Think about the love you worked hardest for in your life. When you go all the way back, whose approval were you originally trying to earn? And can you feel the echo of that first person in the way you love now? 2. In your family, what is the pattern that's trying to make its next jump? If you look at the generation above you and the generation below you, can you name the one thread that's traveling through you right now? And do you want to be the one who lets it pass or the one who interrupts it? 3. Where in your life are you saying the right words, "Don't treat me that way," but not yet building the calm, consistent structure that would make those words true? What's one small piece of follow-through you could add this week? 4. Is there a relationship where you've spent a lot of energy trying to diagnose the other person? to finally name what's wrong with them? If you gently set that question down and asked instead, what have they reliably shown me? And what am I going to do about it? What would change? If today's story lived close to your own, and for so many of you it will, I want you to hear this. The pattern you were handed is not your fault. But now that you can see it, interrupting it becomes your beautiful, hard, worthwhile work. You are allowed to be the one who does it differently. You are allowed to be the soft third link that refuses to harden. This episode is for educational purposes and support. It is not a psychological evaluation, diagnosis, or treatment recommendation for anyone featured, and it is not a substitute for professional mental health care. If today's themes are ones you're living, please reach out to a licensed professional in your area. Take a deep breath, give yourself some grace, and remember, understanding the patterns is the first step. Practicing something healthier is what changes the story. You got this, and I've got you.